Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So thank you so much for joining me, Michael. I'm really pleased to have you on the show. Could you start off by giving us a little bit of a background about yourself and sort of how you come to do this research on decoupling?
Sure. I did my PhD in international relations at Johns Hopkins in the United States. And I mean, my work kind of went through different iterations, different mutations, but eventually I came to be focusing on these questions about the future of global capitalism in an era of multiple crises. And so not just climate change and biodiversity loss, but also things like secular stagnation, slowing growth rates in the global economy, resource depletion, and new kinds of technological risks through advanced acceleration in technologies like AI, nano, biotech, and other innovations. And so I kind of wanted to develop this sort of big picture lens to think about how are these different crises, these different stressors, how are they and how will they come together to potentially force major discontinuities or major changes in our trajectory of economic growth and progress, or at least progress understood in a particular way that has kind of sort of become the dominant organizing framework for thinking about the global economy and human society more generally. And so I began asking these questions about the future and what are some of these possible futures that we might see through the convergence of these different crises. And so the concept of decoupling and kind of engaging with debates around that then became important because it's an important subset of a broader question about the future of capitalism and how it can evolve and adapt in response to many of these crises that we're currently facing, and what the limits of that adaptation might be. And thus, if there are limits to how much it can adapt and revise its basic organizing principles, then it means we may need to shift to a different kind of economy, a different kind of world system in order to deal with many of these challenges. And so the concept of decoupling, as I talk about in the essay description, is this idea that we can continue this trajectory of economic growth and progress defined within these capitalist parameters, that we can continue it, but that it can decouple from all these other environmental impacts. So emissions, biodiversity loss, pollution, deforestation, all these things can begin to decline even as the economic growth train continues. And so if that is true, then it means we can potentially see a continuation of capitalism, although in a different form, one revised to take on a kind of more green hue, reliant more on renewable energy, more renewable materials, more circular economic models that reduce waste, these kind of things, that through these techniques that we can continue this trajectory and have a reformed, adapted capitalism. But if it's not possible, if it turns out that growth inherently involves environmental impacts because it requires, to create value, it requires extracting resources, it requires consuming energy, then it means that if we cannot in fact decouple these things, then we need to move to a different kind of political economy that's not based on endless growth.
Hmm.
Because that really is one of the key kind of structural imperatives of a capitalist system, that it needs to keep growing. It's like a shark, that it needs to keep swimming, otherwise it dies. You know, if growth begins to slow down, then capitalists stop investing. You know, the expectation of future profits is the engine that keeps the system going. And so once that begins to slow down, debts are not able to be repaid, expectation of future profit dwindles, and thus investment drops, unemployment increases as a result, and you have massive crisis. I mean, similar to what we're living in under COVID. And so so an economy that's based on private control of the means of production, private profit as the kind of key engine that incentivizes economic activity, that relies on this system of compound growth. And so if we determine that that can't continue in an era of converging crises, most notably climate, biodiversity, and resource depletion. So if we decide that, you know, that trajectory can't successfully navigate these crises, then we need to begin thinking about alternative trajectories.
Hmm. And it's a really interesting sort of, I guess, premise to want to address, or want to sort of uncover whether there's a possibility for, like, in decoupling. But how sort of feasible is that, given that the world has sort of collectively agreed that the best approach, or the most feasible approach, the one that makes the most sense, is like something like the Paris Accords, where, you know, they end up issuing out a bunch of credits to the highest bidder for, you know, carbon emissions. So has the world already just accepted that the capitalistic approach as a you know, the standard way of dealing with the you know, sustainability?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, yeah, this idea of green growth, it's more or less enshrined and assumed by basically all states and major institutions of global governance, whether you're looking at the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD. You know, all of these institutions basically take for granted that, you know, growth is not negotiable, that the future is going to be one based on growth. And so if we're going to solve these crises, then it has to be one that's based on green growth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, as another example, all the IPCC scenarios. So the IPCC, they project out, you know, what are possible trajectories of future emissions and how this is going to impact climate. And so, like, you know, a certain amount of emissions potentially giving us a certain amount, you know, a certain amount of warming in the atmosphere. And so all of these scenarios assume that economic growth is going to continue. None of them think, oh, maybe we could shift to a steady state, or even reduce economic growth, or shift to a different kind of economic model. None of them ask those kind of questions. And so there are some more heterodox scientists who do raise these questions, but they're, you know, they're outside the mainstream, within the primary forums of global governance and climate governance in particular. Economic growth is assumed. So yeah, absolutely, this assumption that, well, we're going to have to green capitalism, we're going to have to decouple growth, certainly from emissions, from carbon emissions, but also eventually from all of these accumulating environmental impacts, other kinds of pollution, biodiversity loss, deforestation, that we're going to have to decouple from all these things. But yeah, that's certainly the dominant assumption in these realms. And so it's challenged by activists and environmental justice organizations from around the world. But, you know, this is still considered a radical heterodox position. And so how to influence states and global governance arrangements to shift in this trajectory is a huge challenge.
If you were to sort of use a system, not use a system, but let me say experiment with an alternative system to the capitalistic approach,
Mm-hmm.
which approach would you experiment with, and how, like, do you have any ideas in mind how that would take place?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that I'm still thinking through. And so, I mean, on one hand, I think we can look at like grassroots, small-scale experiments or initiatives that embody different kinds of economies and that are based on different kinds of logics. And so, there are these different initiatives around the world that they can go by different names, but commoning is one such initiative, or solidarity economies. And so basically they're forms of exchange and production that aren't just pursued for the ends of profit, but for basically just meeting collective needs and, having common governance arrangements where basically just ordinary people and users can like come together to control how these things are designed, how their fruits are distributed. And so Wikipedia is like one example of like a commons, something that's not run for profit. It's partially controlled by and shaped by its users and by an organization that kind of stewards this knowledge commons as a whole. And so this is kind of one way of thinking about like a post-capitalist, economic enterprise in a way. And so we can see other various initiatives around the world. For example, things like, so I mentioned solidarity economies. These are, areas in which communities self-organize to meet each other's needs. And so like in Greece, during the crisis that was inflicted on them around in the kind of the mid 2010s, many communities got together and thought about how can we make sure that people who are not getting enough to eat or not getting health care, creating various kinds of clinics and new kinds of food distribution networks to meet these kind of needs outside the logic of capitalist profitability. And so these things take various different forms all over the world. And so there are at least ways in which we can see that there is already a different kind of economy that is subordinate to capitalism because they're not based on profit. They're not profitable for investors. Because of that, they're constantly outgunned. They don't have access to financial or human resource needs to really be able to sustain themselves and expand. And so we need to think about what sorts of institutional changes at national and global governance scales can enable some of these initiatives to expand potentially, to become more of the dominant sort of the more common sort of microeconomic foundation of the economy, as opposed to that being, the privately controlled capitalist firm. How could we create a different kind of system where these alternative, more solidarity, ecologically regenerative enterprises can become the key actor? And so how do you do that in practice? This is something that various ecological economists and degrowth scholars have thought about in various ways. And so a universal basic income is one approach that gets thrown out often, which I think would be a super valuable reform in that it creates space for people to engage in more activities that are basically not remunerated, since they're able to survive on an income, they don't have to focus on selling their labor power to survive, so they can engage more in these alternative kinds of economic activities like community gardening, for example, or other kinds of forms of labor that are aimed more at reproducing healthy communities, whether that can include ecosystem restoration work, things that are not profitable for capitalists, so they're not getting paid to do that. So if you have a UBI, at least in theory, the idea is that you could free up people, you could free up creativity to engage in many of these other kinds of activities. So it's sometimes called like a non-reformist reform, in the sense that it's a reform that's compatible with the logic of capitalism, but that one can liberate energy to get people to begin to engage in other kind of activities. And so there are other possible non-reformist reforms we can envision, but that's just kind of the start of thinking about.
I read an article this morning. It was a proposal by big-time billionaire Bill Ackman, who suggested that instead of a universal basic income, he suggested giving sort of like a um, stocks in in say the FTSE 100 or the Nasdaq to newborn children,
Uh,
and that letting that compound growth, letting them be entitled to that compound growth where otherwise they wouldn't have. So by the time they hit a certain age, they have some measure of security. Now, is that still a capitalistic approach to it?
yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, while that might enable the fruits of that growth being relatively equitably shared, at the same time, because it is still dependent on that growth, ultimately we need the economy grow at a compound rate in order for these
Yeah.
investments to be repaid over time. Then yeah, it would still, by growing the economy, that's continuing to put more strenuous material and energy demands on the biosphere. And so, we want to instead shift to a kind of economy where we can meet collective needs, not just meet basic needs, but improve overall well-being, enable more conditions where people can flourish, but where the economy doesn't have to keep growing like that. That's kind of a historically aberrant phenomena that we shouldn't take as simply, the kind of the natural state of things,
Yeah.
that we can redesign the economy in a way that doesn't have to grow, but that can still meet people's needs in a better way than what we have with capitalism today.
On a national scale, could there be any lessons that we can learn from somewhere like Cuba, who has, for 60,
Mhm.
70 years, you know, been in a non-capitalistic uh, environment, and in fact, they are so far removed from capitalism in
Mhm.
so many ways. I guess they can, like, if you go to Cuba, if you sort of read about Cuba, you can, you know, envision a world that constant growth isn't the thing.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm not an expert on Cuba by any means, but certainly, and while we don't want to romanticize, the whole Cuban experience, it's also involved various elements of authoritarianism, which, ideally in a democratic, eco-socialist world, we would not want to have that. But of course, they were also under the pressure from, the U.S. embargo and attempts to assassinate Castro. So, intensive pressure to kind
Yeah.
of militarize, become more authoritarian and centralized. So we can't, simply blame Cuba
Mhm.
only for that. But yeah, certainly in terms of its ability to achieve pretty high human development objectives, have very high healthcare outcomes, for example, being one of the healthiest countries in the world, even though its per capita income is much lower than rich Western states. Also, we can look to its agricultural transformation in the 90s for inspiration. So basically, once the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba had been dependent on the Soviet Union for the vast majority of its fossil fuel imports, on which its various forms of agriculture, industrial agriculture, were dependent. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, like these imports as a result collapsed. And so Cuba was forced into a situation where it had to radically adapt and restructure its food system to be able to produce for the population's needs in a way that was not reliant on fossil fuel
Mhm.
inputs. And so through a combination of central planning and spontaneous self-organized creativity by communities around the country, we began to see a shift to what's often called a more agroecological form of food production. Food production that's more in line with natural rhythms, using things like, instead of pesticides, you use integrated pest management, insects to try and control other pests, not relying on fertilizers, instead more organic ways of building up the soil. You see a proliferation of urban agriculture, community gardening, that was able to then basically meet the population's food needs. And so, I mean, it was a very difficult time, and dietary intake, I think, declined for many people during the time. But it was also broadly successful in adapting, creating a new kind of food system that wasn't just imposed centrally, but involved community cooperation, self-organization to achieve these goals. And so I think we can really look to the Cuba experience, not only in looking at how it's been able to achieve some fairly high human development outcomes with without depending on economic growth, but also how it was able to transform its food system during a major crisis, in this case, losing access to its fossil fuel inputs. Because I think even very ostensibly stable and rich countries today may be facing very similar crises in the future. And so how we might be able to adapt and restructure in ways that promote greater equality and well-being is a key challenge, and I think one that we can learn from the Cuban experience. To think
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you point to so many interesting things there, and also I think is that there's this idea that that there's something inherently evil about a particular system that wasn't Western, or wasn't in the Western world, but I mean, capitalism in itself is going through like enormous sort of reform, not not conscious reform, but reform that is forced upon it by sort of from a social angle. And the example I can think of is this massive drive towards corporate social responsibility, and people wanting to buy from a sort of a company that is more sustainable. So my question is, like, on that basis, is it the fact that capitalism is interested in constant growth that causes the problem, or is it the sort of the running after abnormal profits that causes these incredibly unhealthy sort of side effects for the economy?
Mm-hmm. Could you clarify what you mean by abnormal profits?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, in terms of like from what I've seen with companies and stuff like that, like I can give you an example from the stock market. So the stock market, if a company says that we anticipated profits of X amount and they delivered that exact same amount of profits, then the market is never happy. The market is kind of like down because like is that it? Whereas because it's all driven by sentiment. And if it's better than normal, then people rush to the share and buy it up and buy up the price. So it's in my mind, I think it's just this deep desire for abnormal profits. This unnormal growth, constant expansion, and you pointed to it earlier on, saying that maybe we could think of a steady state. But I mean, even if it's not a steady state, even if it's very small growth, would that sort of enable some kind of sustainable system?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, certainly a more low growth system would have lower impacts on the biosphere, and it makes it easier if growth is only, say, at 1% a year as opposed to 2-3%. I mean, it is easier to decouple from a slower growth trajectory to be able to reduce emissions, reduce environmental impacts in that kind of economy. Of course, in the context of capitalism, 1% growth is perceived by many to be a crisis, and that's a situation where investors are spooked and are not going to be investing at the rates necessary to really maintain economic activity, maintain employment and tax revenues and all the things that are needed to keep the capitalist engine running. But then there can be some adaptations certainly that can be made, like a stronger welfare state to protect workers, to protect unemployed workers, to make sure their needs are being met, so that things to make something like low growth more relatively sustainable. And this is something that many degrowth scholars point to, is that we need to think about what reforms can we make within the current system that can make us less dependent on growth, make well-being less dependent on growth, so that when we do hit these crises, or if we're in a context of low growth and stagnation, basically that it doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, corporate profits are going to be down, but if people are having their needs met, able to engage in what really matters to them, things like leisure time, time with families, having their basic needs, food, water, energy, sanitation, healthcare. As long as these things are met, then does it really matter whether we have endless GDP growth or not? And so, yeah, it's a question of what reforms, what kinds of forms of societal restructuring will it take so that we could potentially have a major crisis or have economic stagnation, either low growth or even no growth, while still ensuring that basic needs are met. And so the claim is that once we, and here things are like a little complicated and contested, but the idea is that once we start to move in that direction, then it means we're really moving towards something like a post-capitalist system, because we're moving towards a system where basically basic needs, meeting people's needs regardless of profit considerations, become the main priority, become the main goal towards which economic activity is organized, which would probably require major changes in the ownership structure of the economy. For example, it would require major changes in the way the financial system works. Instead of having these huge banks channeling capital into the most profitable enterprises and creating all these mountains of debt that then need to be repaid through growth. A lot of things would need to change to get to an economy where it's growing very slowly or not at all, but it's still meeting the basic needs of everyone. And so how do we get to that? I don't have very great answers to. I don't think anyone does really. It's something I'm trying to think about. Like, I'm really trying to think about what might this transition actually look like? What are the various...
Don't you think it's like major shocks, though? Don't you think it's like a major shock, like the coronavirus pandemic, that forced...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It would definitely have to, I think, be in the context of major crises. And so, I mean, the problem, though, is that crises are double-edged in the sense that they create these opportunities to think differently, to realize some of the irrationalities and injustices that are based on our current way of organizing things. And so certainly the COVID-19 crisis has been a window or an X-ray into many of these global and national scale injustices, things like looking at, the exploitation of essential workers, the way that minority racialized populations have often, been hit the hardest by COVID because of, the economic conditions that they live under. And so it has been, this crisis has been an X-ray into these injustices. And so it can, in this sense, create more of a sense that, like, we could do things differently. Actually, maybe this system is not, the most natural or best way to organize human affairs. And so many different things have become thinkable, or at least for a time, they became more thinkable during the COVID-19 crisis. Things like universal basic income, states like Denmark in particular, basically guaranteeing to pay the wages of workers, even if they were laid off. And so it does open up the realm of possibility. And we're going to see many shocks like this in the future. And I think we're going to see worse shocks for sure in the coming decades. But at the same time, these shocks also create, because of the impacts on employment and real economic suffering, it also can make, it intensifies calls to return to growth at all costs, that we need to revive the economy. Things like climate goals, environmental protections, these can get sidelined and say, whatever we got to do, we got to cut regulations, we got to bail out the airlines without conditions, to make sure people are having their jobs, that their needs are met. And so crises can, on one hand, open windows, but it can also intensify these pressures to get the growth engine back on track. And so this creates many challenges, because I do think that we are going to see some intense shocks that are going to lead more and more people to question the rationality and the logic of capitalism and economic growth. And I think there are going to be opportunities for movements, if they're able to increase their power and their organizational coherence. I think there's going to be opportunities to push these alternative narratives, to say that the solution is to shift to a more equitable post-capitalist economy, not to try and keep it afloat by any means necessary. But at the same time, these kind of more reactionary, no, we need to return to growth. You're trying to kill the economy by appealing to some vague, future environmental outcome. And so, those reactionary narratives can also be powerful and resonate with a lot of people in the context of a crisis. So it's gonna be a battle of narratives and organizational power and what's going to be able to win out. And I think there's a lot that we are up against, or at least those like me who want to promote a post-growth, post-capitalist, more equitable economy. But I do think there are possibilities, and that we need to strategize and think, what might those be? How can we prepare for these moments?
So where do you build on your research from here? What do you have in mind for the future?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm working on turning my dissertation into a book.
Oh, nice.
I hope will be at least in draft form in the next year, and hopefully have a contract and have the book out sometime in the next few years. Unclear when that will happen, because these things can be complicated with publishing and editing. But so this book, I hope to be an ambitious synthesis of a lot of the stuff I've done, and really thinking about what are the possible futures facing the world system, and how can we integrate an analysis of all these different processes, from global capitalist expansion to climate change, mass extinction, resource depletion, and technological advance, and to bring these things together to weave together a coherent narrative about what are some possible future trajectories. And so, the eco-socialist or post-growth world that's able to meet human needs within biosphere constraints, that's kind of the more hopeful, semi-utopian alternative. What I would say, the best case scenario we might hope for. And so, I want to continue to work out what might that look like, how might that come about, and to think more carefully about what would be some of the conflicts, the trade-offs, the risks that it would confront. Not to paint some kind of happy utopian picture, but to think that it would be a better world, and that it's something that we should strive for and struggle towards, but also to think what are the conflicts and challenges that it would confront, and let's try and be as honest about those as possible. On the other hand, to consider what I call the techno-authoritarian scenario. And so I talk about this in my Dangers of Decoupling paper. Basically, that if we rely on these technologies, that if fourth industrial revolution technologies are able to continue this train of economic growth, that I think they will create immense pressures towards new kinds of techno-authoritarian governance that use things like big data, artificial intelligence to intensify spying on ordinary citizens, and that in conjunction with many of these security risks that we're going to be facing, there's going to be both more and more power to securitize populations, as well as there's going to be more fear and more insecurity, and so more and more people may be willing to accept these kind of constraints on civil liberties, like public assembly, free speech, for example. So, like, including in liberal democracies like in the US and UK, I think these techno-authoritarian trends are very real, very present, but I think there could be further thresholds, similar to 9/11, but similar thresholds where these forms of securitization further intensify. So I think that's a darker trajectory, but one that doesn't see total civilizational collapse as a result of these things. But I do think the risk of collapse, that we're not going to be able to solve these things through technological innovations, that growth is going to come to a halt, but that movements to pursue another trajectory, if they're too weak, if they're outgunned by the forces of reaction of the status quo who are trying to continue this machine, whatever the costs, then I think we're on the road to some kind of global collapse. And what that would look like, what that would mean, it's a very scary, it's undoubtedly a very scary and some extent depressing perspective that I think we need to be serious and honest about and talk about that openly. And I think that while something like a collapse, we don't know what that would look like exactly. It wouldn't be an overnight everything falls apart. It would be more of a kind of a slower, uneven process hitting different regions, different states at different speeds. But what that would look like, how might it unfold? This is something I want to continue to think more about, but also to think about if we are indeed headed for an era of political and economic collapse in the future. I think it's important not to simply see that as the end all be all, the end of the world, human extinction, game over. It might be, but I think it's also possible to envision new struggles, new possibilities for different forms of life that may be able to emerge from the wreckage. And so I think that there is a possibility for at least some glimmer of hope, even in some of the darker scenarios. But kind of what my work is trying to do, and what many others are also trying to do today, is to think more, to really ask questions more about these different scenarios, so that we can begin planning, begin strategizing. Because really, I mean, I hope that my work will be able to inform some of these strategic questions about how we approach and plan, prepare for the future, not just as individuals, but as movements trying to create a different world.
I think this discourse is incredibly important, particularly for younger people who are sort of, opening up their eyes in a world that is being exposed for what it is, in terms of, or a system that's being exposed for what it is, and people are becoming incredibly. So I think your work and the work of academics like yourself, who are looking at this post-capitalist structure, what the world would be like if capitalism sort of halts or collapses. And I think this discourse is incredibly important, and we need voices like this to be heard. So I definitely urge everyone listening to, to take a moment to, look up Michael's profile, and we'll share it on the episode. And just get accustomed to these ideas, because these ideas are necessary. On that note, where can people find you online?
So I mean, they can find my profile on the SOAS University of London page. I'm part of the Politics and International Studies department, and so you can find me there. It lists a few of my articles. Also, I have a page on academia.edu for anyone who has a profile there or who uses that at all. Still a little underdeveloped at present, but working on it. So yeah, but people can.
Are you on Twitter by any chance?
No, I've kind of shied away from some more intense social media.
No, I don't blame you.
Yeah, because I don't know, for me it's a bit much. Facebook is already kind of a lot, so I have the other stuff.
Yeah, well, definitely I do urge people to check out Michael's work. Michael, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I feel like this conversation was incredibly important to have, and help inform myself. So thank you so much for joining me.
I really appreciate it. It's been enjoyable for me as well.
Cheers. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.